Hi everyone, Pastor Jimmy at Mount Pleasant Baptist Church. We're starting a new video series on the life of Moses, specifically on the leadership of Moses. We're going to be looking at his life and how he grew as a leader. We're not going to be looking at every detail in the life of Moses. There's a lot to look at in the book of Exodus. But what we're going to look at is how he became the leader that God wanted him to be and how God molded him and made him into a leader. And how we can learn a lot of these things in our own life and how we can see how God wants to use us in our own lives. To start with, in this video, we're just going to look kind of at the background of Moses, where he came from, how he was born, some important details about Moses before we get into God's calling him. So Moses' story is a very popular story, even for non-Christians that read the Bible or people who have heard Bible stories. If you go to Sunday school for very long, you're going to hear the story of Moses. Moses was born in Egypt. The Israelite people were enslaved in Egypt. The Pharaoh of Egypt at the time thought that the Israelites had grown too numerous in number, and he had decided that if they decided to ever revolt or go against him, that they could overthrow the Egyptian government. So he told them to kill all the babies. He called all the midwives, told them to kill any male baby that was born. They went through and they refused to do it, so he began to take matters into his own hands. And so that's where we pick up with Moses. His mother had Moses, and when she had Moses, she hid him for several months. And so the Lord watched over her and her family and Moses. And then at some point, a few months later, Moses was getting too big to keep in the house, probably a little too noisy. She couldn't hide him any longer. So she made a little basket, put it in the Nile River, and let it float. And we see in the book of Exodus, we see where she sent Miriam, Moses' older sister, to watch over the basket to see what happens. Well, the basket comes, and Pharaoh's daughter finds the basket. And to make the long story short, what happens, she falls in love with the little baby Moses. Miriam comes in and goes and gets her mom, and her mom is actually able to raise Moses. So he is raised by his mom in Pharaoh's palace as the grandson, I guess it would be, of Pharaoh. And so he is brought up in a completely different way than most of the Israelite people. All the other Israelites, Hebrews, are slaves in the land. But here is Moses. Some would call him a prince of Egypt at this time. But here is Moses being raised by Pharaoh's daughter, getting this Egyptian education, getting all the things that a prince, if you want to call him that, of Egypt would get. And so we see him in the Bible, we see him grow up. Now, he grew up in the Egyptian palace or whatever they were called. He grew up in that. But one thing that we notice is that he still remembered who he was and where he came from. He still understood that he was a Hebrew. We still understand that he knew that his lineage wasn't Egyptian, that he was one of the Hebrew people. And so we see later on in Exodus chapter 2, we see in verse 11, it says, "One day after Moses had grown up, he went out to where his own people were and watched them at their hard labor. He saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, one of his own people. Looking this way and that, and seeing no one, he killed the Egyptian and hid him in the sand. The next day he went out and saw two Hebrews fighting. He asked the one in the wrong, 'Why are you hitting your fellow Hebrew?' The man said, 'Who made you ruler and judge over us? Are you thinking of killing me as you killed the Egyptian?' Then Moses was afraid and thought, 'What I did must have become known.'" Not the way you would really be introduced to a leader in the Bible, or at least you wouldn't think so. Here we see Moses. One of the first things we're introduced to Moses as he's grown up here, we see Moses going out, seeing the Egyptian beating a Hebrew, and we see him killing the Egyptian. Looking both ways, knowing what he was going to do, he goes and he kills this Egyptian here. So this isn't the introduction you might think of a great leader that God would use. But this shows us that God is willing to use anyone. All of our past mistakes, all those things, if we're willing to turn those all over to God, as we'll see later on, God can use any of us. God can use anyone as long as we're willing to turn our lives over to Him. So here's Moses. Here he is, this Hebrew raised in the Egyptian courts, and we see him come in, and he still cares enough for his people. He still cares enough for them, even now, being raised as one in the courts of the Egyptian Pharaoh. We see him still care enough to stand up for his people. And then later on, we see two of his people fighting each other, and he goes to them and he says, "Why are you fighting amongst each other?" So we see even early on that he cared for his people. I want us to remember that as we continue this study, to understand that in his heart, he already had a heartfelt care and a concern for his own people before God ever called him. And so a lot of times, God knows our hearts. God knows what's inside of us. He knows our talents. He knows the things that we desire. He sees those in us, and He'll call us to work and do things with those desires in our life. And so let's remember that as we continue the study in the life of Moses. But in today's lesson, as we introduce to him, know that, he's not this perfect person. He's not this perfect person that God raised up from birth to be the perfect leader. He is a human. He's scarred. He's got sin in his life. But yet God will use this man in great ways, which shows us today that God can use any of us in great ways if we're just willing to let go of all of our sin, willing to let go of all of our pride, all of the arrogance, all the things that keep us from God. If we're willing to let go of those, give our life over to Him, God can and will use us all in great ways. It doesn't matter who we are, where we've come from, how we were raised. It doesn't matter anything other than, are we willing to give it all over to God and let Him use us in a way that we've never imagined? If we're willing to do that, then God can and will do great things in our life for His glory and for His kingdom.